everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 250 library systems across 37 states with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the wonderful best-selling and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our series year-round. Today, we are honored and so excited to have New York Times bestselling author David Epstein with us to talk about his book, Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. Welcome. Thank you for being here. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very well.
Good. Great. We're so excited to get started, but I do want to give everybody that standard quick housekeeping information that keeps everything flowing more smoothly, and then we will dive right in. We have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we will also be taking your additional questions throughout our conversation. So viewers, when you have a direct question for David, you can click that questions button that's just below the live stream video at any time to submit your questions. In addition, we invite you to interact with your fellow viewers in the live chat box, also located below this stream. It's always fun to see where everybody's tuning in from. If you are unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours. And in that email, you can find a link to the recording. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today. David Epstein obsesses over mistranslations of scientific research and tries to temper the misconceptions that follow them. He is the author of the New York Times bestsellers Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, and The Sports Gene, both of which have been translated in more than 20 languages. He was previously an investigative reporter at ProPublica, and before that, the science writer at Sports Illustrated. He lives in Washington, D.C., but has lived in a tent in the Arctic and on a ship in the Pacific Ocean, naturally. Welcome again, David. We're so excited to have you here. Thank you for joining me and our consortium of libraries.
It's totally a pleasure. I'm honored to be appearing through a bunch of libraries, and we are like a library-loving family. And libraries and bookstores are like the places that I go to find interest that I didn't know I had. And we're imparting that to our son in our family. This is him when we made a recent visit to a local library. There he is with my wife reading a book, which then I couldn't get him to eat unless I kept reading the book to him. And then we went to visit my brother, and he wouldn't pay any attention to him and was still reading the book. Then we went to have lunch, and he wouldn't read the book. So we were sitting and he wouldn't eat unless we sat on the floor and read the book. And then this is when he's supposed to be sleeping. And if you can see, this is on the baby monitor. It's dark in there, and he's still trying to read the book.
Oh.
So for us, our library is a family place, a community place. Like during COVID, it became much more a community gathering place, a testing place. And so I think we think of libraries not just as like places where people come and go and get books, but as sort of a node in our community. And I'm appreciative of all the libraries that do that.
Yeah, I love to hear that. Love to, especially cultivating that passion so young. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing.
My pleasure.
Can you, I guess diving right in, can you talk to us a bit about your background, especially with those little nuggets in your bio there, like living in a tent in the Arctic and on a ship in the Pacific Ocean? And Aaron would like to know, when did you know that you wanted to be an author and a writer?
Yeah, good question. So my background, like I was at one point in my life on track to being a scientist in the environmental sciences. In fact, I have a master's degree in environmental science. But I think sort of two things happened that got me off that track. One of which is sort of tragic, just to give the disclaimer, but basically as I was like living in the tent in the Arctic, studying the carbon cycle, and my work was getting like very, very, very focused and very narrow. And I was kind of asking myself, am I the type of person who wants to spend my whole life learning sort of one or two things that are new to the world, that are very sort of niche, or the type of person who wants to spend much shorter spans of time learning things new to me and synthesizing them and sharing them and that sort of thing. And I was the latter. And it also happened that I used to be a competitive runner and had a training partner who died at the end of a race
Oh, wow.
from a genetic heart condition that was undiagnosed. And I got really interested in investigating that because like our local newspapers just said sort of heart attack, and he was like one of the top ranked runners in his age group in the country. And I sort of thought, like, what does that even mean, heart attack? And I sort of saw it as this opportunity to merge my interest in sports and science and investigate this and do something I thought was meaningful. And that, in fact, was the way that I segued into writing, specifically to write about sudden cardiac death in athletes. That path sort of led me to become the science writer at Sports Illustrated, basically. So that wasn't anything I had plotted out. In terms of the question of when I thought I'd be a writer, looking back, I was really interested in like stories and would tell stories and like write stories when I was a little kid. But then I think I basically abandoned it for a very long time, and didn't really become a voracious reader until my late 20s, I would say. But even when I was in sciences, I thought I would be like, I knew I sort of I liked writing, and I kind of revered writing and authors. And so I thought I would become a scientist who writes. So I think I always sort of had it in the back of my mind, although I wasn't really pursuing it. And then when I got interested in this sudden cardiac death in athletes, I was very much like, I want to write about this so more people know about it and we raise awareness and things like that. And that interest in genetics led to my first book project. And that's when I really just started like inhaling books and like thinking about structure of writing and all these other sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you say structure of writing. That's a question that comes up constantly, is how do you structure writing? What's your research and writing process like? And Donald and John both asked if like the phenomena that you describe in range between specialization, specialists and generalists, is that if that affects your writing and what you think of yourself as.
That's an interesting point, because to some degree, this is, so there are a few questions in there. To some degree, the issue of like how I think of myself is just semantic, right? When I was in the sciences and then I go over and I become a sports writer, there were stops between that. Like I worked as the overnight, like the midnight to morning reporter at a tabloid, which of course is all just like crime stuff. Like there were I didn't just like go straight to Sports Illustrated, but when I left the sciences and become a journalist, it's like to the people that I knew in the sciences, I was suddenly becoming a generalist. But to the people at the sports magazine, I was like the specialist because I came in with this science background. So a lot of it is just sort of semantic. I certainly think of myself as a generalist, though. And yeah, I mean, by the time anything I write is like out for other people to read, I'm already feeling like an incompetent beginner at whatever other topic I'm already in. So it's this weird feeling of something coming out, and if it goes well, like people perceiving you as competent, well, I'm feeling completely incompetent, and constantly feeling like a beginner. I think that's one of the challenges for people who have a lot of different interests in general. But can I zig over to the structure question?
Yeah.
Also, okay. So, and then research and writing is probably a different one. So tell me if you still want me to hit on that one after. But the most useful experience I think I ever had for thinking about writing structure was actually from film editing. And I had a friend who had a repetitive stress injury. And so he had a documentary about wind energy that he had to edit, and he was not supposed to really be using his mouse or his keyboard much. And so he asked me if I could do, I was just the motor skills. He was like the brain. He would tell me what to do. I had no experience editing film, and I would just execute it. And what I realized in that process was that he had all this film, or what sometimes reporters would call string that you gather, which is like all your information that you gather. And then he would cut it up into chunks, and everything between those chunks hits the cutting room floor. So you've just done a lot of editing. And then basically the whole game was, how do you arrange those chunks? So what I call the out point of one of them, which is typically a fade out, transitions to the in point of the next one. And it's just that sort of arranging. And so when I'm structuring information, I don't spend as much time thinking about the macro structure of a book as I think a lot of people do. Like historians have an easy macro structure. They just follow chronology, basically.
Mm-hmm.
They go from like birth to death for the most part. I think a lot of books, like a lot of authors put in a lot of time to thinking about the macro structure. I spend a lot more time thinking about the microstructure of how does one out point naturally get the reader to that next endpoint. And I see this sort of everywhere. So when I started thinking about this and would watch the films of like Wes Craven, sometimes the material in those films was basically ridiculous, I think. And yet they would be arranged in such a way that I'd be like, yeah, I kind of want to come back from commercial break just to see, because it's like wherever it left off really seeded the next question. And that's how I think of line spaces between sections and also chapter breaks. Because these amorphous topics that I'm investigating, they're not going to have a clean answer in the end or a clean macro structure like a personal narrative might. And so I'm much more attuned to how do I arrange these like seedings of questions and then get at them, like sort of whet the reader's appetite and then get at those questions right after I seeded it. And so I still use this filmmaking analogy of having chunks that I arrange the in and out points for when I'm writing. That's how I think about structure a lot.
It's probably one of the most fascinating answers I've ever had about structure. It's very interesting. It makes me, I then do want to hear a little bit more about then your research process, because I would imagine that writing and putting those chunks together for your writing is a lot different than how you're approaching your research. Am I wrong?
Well, I think you're right and wrong. I'll tell you how I think of it, I guess. And I should say both of my books have been very different from my book proposals. Okay. So because in the book proposal, you sort of guess at some of the things that you're going to find, and like maybe I just have bad intuition or something. I don't know, but it turns out that the stuff that I then learn is totally different. And so the early phase of research for me is like very broad net. Like think of this question: how broad or specialized to be, and when and why, and like a lot of the challenge for me is like drawing the boundaries around that question so that I even sort of decide what's in play and what's not, and then investigate that from a lot of different angles. And the difficult thing is it's amorphous and there's never going to be a perfect answer. The cool thing about it, I think, is that topic, or the topic of my first book, which was like the balance of nature and nurture and developing skills. These are things that are important to everyone and that we're usually like talking about almost every day, whether we think about it that way or not, but it's usually purely intuition or personal stories. And if you can bring some research, and interesting stories to those conversations, hopefully it makes those conversations more productive and interesting than just intuition alone. And so early on, I'm casting this really broad net, and I use something I call a master thought list, where basically, as in the early phase, I'm spending a ton of time reading scientific journal articles, basically, and also some books and doing some interviews. And I think of the master thought list as like almost like a wiki of my brain on a particular topic, where if there's an interesting statistic or quote or graphic or whatever, I'll put it in the master thought list, which can be just a Word document. Sometimes I've used some information organization programs as well, but I actually think the simple, just like word processing document is pretty good. And I'll put that in the document, and I'll put the citation, so it helps me keep track of my citations. And eventually, as sort of things coalesce around an idea, I'll put what I call a tag over it, which is just like a title. And then I'll write a bunch of words that I think I would search for if I wanted to find that topic again, just like, some of them sensible and some of them just random associations I think I would make. And as I generate more and more of those tags, I start moving the like ones closer to one another. So shuffling it a lot. And that sort of ends up in some ways being like a little bit of a preliminary storyboard, basically. So in that way, it is kind of filmic, I would say, in the research phase, because I'm kind of getting things that interest me to coalesce into thematic chunks, basically.
Right.
And then so that list turns out to be this like personal wiki that I'll refer to a lot, and it helps me keep my citations as I go, which is very important.
It sounds like you either had a really, really good research class in your studies, or you could be a natural librarian. The way that you're organizing your research, yeah.
Well, well, the stuff, I mean, I don't use my, like, again, having like a master's degree in geological sciences doesn't. I don't write about anything related to that whatsoever, but some tremendously useful skills came out of that experience, like researching in peer-reviewed journals and keeping track of citations and, being statistics literate and those sorts of things. So there was a time when I thought, when I got off that path and said, well, that was a waste. In retrospect, it was sort of the differentiator for me as a writer, was this oddball background, basically.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, well, so let's dive into range then. So for those who've not read your book yet, do you mind giving a synopsis?
No, I'll wait while they go and finish.
Okay, all right.
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. No, I'd say, well, so the subtitle is, of course, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. But I would say that maybe the theme that's really on every page, maybe the most true, but less marketable subtitle, is that sometimes the things you can do to get a head start or optimize in the short term can actually undermine your long-term development. And that's whether that is learning a specific skill, whether that be in sports or math, whether that be deciding what to study in college, whether that be how you go about your career in terms of, do you sometimes sacrifice going deeper for sort of coming up and becoming broader? And so I think it's an argument that while we both need generalists and specialists, these people who have broad experiences and thereby develop broad knowledge bases and skill sets and networks, have actually become increasingly valuable as people around them have sort of rushed to specialize and see a smaller and smaller piece of every puzzle they're working on. So that there are kind of increasing advantages to being someone that can see across the trenches, so to speak.
Mhm. Well, Ariana and Christine are they need to know what piqued your interest or inspired you to take on this topic and write this book.
Yeah, I'll give you like the medium long answer here. So in my first book, I stridently critiqued the research underlying the so-called 10,000 hours rule.
Uh-huh.
The idea that the only path to expertise is through 10,000 hours of so-called deliberate practice, which is like not playing around, very effortful, focused on error correction. And that brought me into public conflict with Malcolm Gladwell, who had written about the 10,000 hours rule. And the first time he and I met, we were invited to this conference called the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. It's like very famous in the sports world. Lots of NBA personnel go and talk analytics. And we were asked there to debate athletic development. And, he's a very clever guy. And I didn't want to get embarrassed on stage. So I did my homework. I saw he had written about the advantage of starting early in deliberate practice. And so I went and looked at the research in athletes and found that if studies that actually tracked athletes over the course of their development found that those who went on to become elite actually tended to have spent less time in deliberate practice early on than athletes who plateaued at lower levels. And they tended to have what scientists call sampling period, where they do a variety of different physical activities. Sorry, I forgot to turn off the gesture control thing. They gain these sort of broader mix of skills, sometimes called physical literacy. They learn about their own interests and abilities, and they delay specializing until later than peers who plateau at lower levels. And so when I shared that, he kind of said after, that doesn't comport with what I said. Like had both been competitive runners. Do you want to come run with me tomorrow and we'll talk about it more?
Cool.
And so we became running buddies and would talk or argue about this stuff on our own time. And so, I'd go home and read up on the literature, and we started thinking about it outside of sports, what we called the Roger versus Tiger problem, which ended up being the introduction to the book, Roger versus Tiger, contrasting the Roger Federer and Tiger Woods models. And so at first I was just interested in reading studies so that I could come back and have these interesting conversations while we were running. And I wasn't so much thinking about writing about it at first, even though I started to see analogies in lots of different areas where what I thought, the idea that you should just get a head start and kind of specialize quickly,
Mhm.
It wasn't the case in sports, and started to see it wasn't the case in a lot of other domains. And then I had this experience where I spoke to a group of former special forces operators in the military, a small group, shared some of this data, just like a little bit of it. And it was like a catharsis for them. They felt they'd had these incredible experiences, but felt that they were so behind because some of their peers, who had not been in the military, had moved along in their careers, whatever they were. And I thought it was interesting that these people with their incredible experiences felt behind, even though everyone would want them to have had the leadership experiences that they had. And so that sort of cued in my head, maybe there are a lot of people out there feeling like this, and I should share some of this research more broadly. It turned out, I wasn't conscious of it at the time. It turned out I was one of these people who felt very self-conscious about it. And as so many things, so much research is me search. And the more I got into it, the more I realized how sort of lucky I had been to zigzag a lot in my own career development.
Hmm. I think like specialism or a specialization, specialists, it kind of shows up in weird ways throughout your life, even like applying for a home mortgage. Like the underwriters want to know how long you've been working in your industry because it looks stronger if you've been doing the same, not even the same job, but the same type of job. Even if you've only been if you've been in the same industry for 10 years and you switch jobs all of a sudden. It was a question that came up even recently. How does your previous career sync up with the one you're doing now? So I was like, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's too bad that they look at it. But obviously they're trying to gauge stability, right? They
Right.
don't really want someone who is fired up about career progression. They want someone who's going to be the same person 10 years from now that they are today, right? So that they can put it into an algorithm that calculates their risk.
Hmm.
But that's not really how people that want to progress work. And it's unfortunate because there's all this. I mean, LinkedIn, for example, showed me some of their data where they did an analysis of 500,000 members because they can have these huge data sets. And it showed that the best predictor of who was going to go on to become an executive was the number of different job functions that someone had worked across. And I've had this discussion with someone there where I felt, well, maybe your product is actually militating against people doing that because they want this very clean progression in their LinkedIn. And
Hmm.
they kind of said, we think we're doing fine. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's not in the interest of the borrower, right? That's
Right.
in the interest of the bank feeding, like looking for stability. But
And like the HR departments that
yeah,
are looking for that progression, as you put it.
yeah. I mean, the HR department. Let me share a few. I write a little bit in range about the work of a woman named Abby Griffin and her colleagues who study serial innovators. So these are people who make repeated creative contributions to their organizations wherever they go, even when they're moving around. And I'm going to share just like a few uh, phrases that I pulled from her work that describe who these people are, because you can sometimes hear her sort of talking to HR people in her writing, I think. So,
Okay.
so she describes them as systems thinkers. They have additional knowledge from peripheral domains. They repurpose things that are already available. They have an ability to connect disparate pieces of information in new ways. They synthesize information from lots of different sources. They appear to flit among ideas. Doesn't really sound like a compliment. They have a broad range of interests. They read more and more widely than their peers. They have a need to learn across domains, and they have a need to communicate with people with expertise outside of their domain, right? So you can almost hear in her writing her saying, dear HR people, if you define your job too narrowly, you're going to make sure that you select these people out or force them to move between organizations in order to gain that kind of breadth that makes them so powerful. And I think that's what we see a lot of lateral mobility for these sorts of people. And I don't know that you can create those kind of people, but I think it's very clear that you can stifle them by not allowing them this sort of broad scope um, in their work. And so, despite all of the cultural forces, right? This is still what's showing up in her research. This is still what's showing up in the LinkedIn research about future executives. So even despite all the cultural pressures,
Mhm.
uh, this is still the pattern. So I imagine that there's a lot more untapped potential for people with a broad view if we actually encouraged it even a little for people who want to.
That's absolutely right. And the mention of HR, Rhett posed a question. I'm an HR careers researcher at the University of Cincinnati and assign my senior undergrad students to read your book every semester. One issue that
Cool.
comes up for some students is what advice do you have on dropping your most developed tools, which can seem like turning away from significant chunks of your past experience, accumulated effort, and fading identities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the that's really cool to hear that students are engaging with it. So thank you for that, Rhett. And just for people who haven't read the book, the penultimate chapter talks about dropping tools as it's an analogy from the work um, of a famous psychologist and sociologist, basically, who examined tragedies in wilderness firefighting and would notice that when these very highly skilled wilderness firefighters, when there was a tragedy and loss of life, an unusual thing was that the firefighters' bodies would often be found with 100 or 150 pounds of tools that they were carrying. And if they had dropped those, they would have been able to run to safety. But those were such a part of their job that they would often refuse, either not think of or refuse to drop them, even when it was the difference between life and death. And in this area of research, that's used as kind of an analogy to what's more often called the Einstellung effect, which is a psychological term that means if you've solved a problem a certain way over and over and over and over, you'll keep solving it that way, even if it's no longer the solution to the problem. And so dropping your tools means kind of being able to recognize that some of your skills and knowledge or some of your literal tools work for certain types of problems, but that there are other solutions and that sometimes the problem and the situation changes. And I think what we want is cognitive flexibility, basically. And I think the way that you get that is, one, by giving people lots of different challenges that they face. So there's a part in Range where I talked to a researcher named Deidre Gentner, who's like one of the world's experts in novel problem solving and using analogies to solve problems. And she said, she sort of summarized, she said there's this classic finding in skill acquisition research that she summarized as breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer, meaning the wider the variety of problems you've had to face, the more likely you'll be able to transfer your knowledge to new situations. Transfer means taking your skills and knowledge and being able to apply it to situations you haven't quite seen before. And what predicts your ability to do that is the breadth of problems you've faced in your training. And so I think one way to help people be more flexible in dropping their familiar solutions is to make sure that you're really varying up the kind of problems that they're facing in their training, which forces them to build these more generalized models. It forces them to build so-called making connections knowledge, where they have to connect the stuff they know to different concepts and problems, as opposed to using procedures knowledge, where they just know how to like execute certain procedures over and over and over. So I think varying that up, and also the people in some of Gentner's work, there was a group of students that turned out to be basically the best at solving problems they hadn't seen before. And they were these students who had no major. They were in this program where they just had lots of different minors, and in different sciences specifically. And they would learn the problem solving approach of all these different disciplines. And that seemed to empower them to have this broad toolbox where when they saw a new problem, they could match a strategy from their toolbox to the problem, instead of just having these procedures that they could execute when they perfectly recognize a problem. So I think part of it is really helping people build a really broad toolbox so that they're not reliant on a small set of tools that they'll just use over and over and over again, even if it's not the solution to the problem.
Mm-hmm. And so with the research out there that being more general and having this broad toolbox is actually more effective in problem solving, can you talk more about like this obsession then with specialization, and maybe when it began, and why is it so hard to kind of change everybody's thought process on that?
Yeah, I think specialization as a sort of good cultural message, it's waxed and waned over time, basically. Because I mean, if you think of medieval guilds, were very specialized, were made to help people specialize, and they did a really good job of ensuring certain quality control for their areas, but they were also very anti-innovation, basically, right? So it was this double-edged sword. I think for much of the 20th century, in a greater degree of specialization in a lot of areas made a lot of sense, where people faced more. A lot of people were able to have a kind of a discrete period of training or education, followed by a period of working where they could do similar things over and over for a long period of time, and lateral mobility was very limited. But then you kind of fast forward to the whatever you want to call it, information age, knowledge age, creativity age, and that changes. Now it's not such a great world for people that have a discrete period of training followed by a discrete period of working. It's like much more having to take those skills and apply them in a new way, or update your knowledge and do creative problem solving. And so sometimes I think when our parents or grandparents are giving us the advice to, figure out your thing and stick to it, that is well-meaning and may have made sense for them, but may not make as much sense anymore in this age of extreme lateral mobility and more short-lived jobs and that sort of thing. And so, but I think that advice is just intuitive, right? Like, I think when we see two people that are separated by this much in some skill or whatever, our intuition is that that's going to be a stable parallel trajectories and they'll always be separated by that much. But that's just not how human development works at all. Like in basically any area of skill development. So I think we need to think about development as this much windier path where sometimes doing things that cause you to be behind actually pay off in the long term. And we all accept that with a certain level of schooling, right? We realize people need to do things that aren't just training for the exact job that they're going to have. But I think it's our intuition. And then it's these stories like I opened the book talking about the Tiger Woods versus the Roger Federer story, the Tiger Woods story, where it was this consummate kind of 10,000 hours story of early specialization, where you can go on YouTube and see him at age 2, showing off his swing on national television. Whereas Roger Federer played all these different sports. He wasn't so. Tiger Woods at age 3 was saying, "I'm going to be the next Jack Nicklaus." When Roger Federer got good enough to warrant an interview with his local newspaper, the reporter asked him what he'd buy with his first hypothetical paycheck if he ever became a pro, and he said a Mercedes. And his mother was appalled and asked the reporter if she could listen to the interview recording. It turned out he had said "mehr CDs" in Swiss German. He just wanted more CDs, not a Mercedes. And she was fine with that. But he was not focused on being the next great from an early age. The interesting thing is that these two athletes are equally famous as adults, I would say. But even everyone knows, even people who don't care at all about sports know the Tiger Woods story. Even people who are tennis enthusiasts don't know the Roger Federer story, even though the Roger Federer story is the norm according to the science, not the exception. I think the Tiger Woods story is very dramatic. Like when Malcolm said that the video of 2-year-old Tiger Woods showing off his swing on national TV is a human cat video, so just like destined for virality. I think that's true. I also think it just feels like this tidy narrative that we can extrapolate to anything that we want to be good at in our own lives. And I think that's really well-meaning, but I also think it's an important mistake because golf in many ways is a uniquely horrible model of almost everything else that humans want to learn. Golf is what the psychologist Robin Hogarth called a kind, and I go through this in range, a kind learning environment where next steps and goals are clear, rules never change, patterns repeat, not a lot of human behavior involved, feedback is quick and accurate, work next year will look like work last year. On the other end of the spectrum are what Hogarth called wicked learning environments, where next steps and goals may not just be given to you. Rules may change if there are rules. Patterns don't just repeat. Feedback could be delayed or inaccurate or not automatic. Lots of human dynamics involved. Work next year might not look like work last year. Most of us are increasingly spending our working lives in more of this, more toward the wicked end, increasingly, whereas golf is all the way toward the kind end. And so I think we take some of the wrong extrapolations from that message, but with good intent.
Mm-hmm. So the specialists then would be well equipped for kind, but maybe flounder a little bit in the wicked environment, correct?
And I should say that and you can actually see this in some data that matches people for all sorts of characteristics, but then compares people who got very career focused training versus those who got sort of broader general education first. And the pattern is that those who get the focused education jump out to an income lead basically, but then they end up so much less adaptable that over their lifetime, they lose out to the people who had the broader base. but they get a head start. And it's not to say that we don't need specialists. Like, I think that would be crazy. I think it's that we need to recognize. I think we don't have to be concerned about underdoing it in incentivize in telling people they should specialize. So I think we do have to worry about underdoing it on the other side. And I think there are these interesting double-edged swords, right? Like in medicine, which is sort of, you'd be crazy to say that increasing specialization in medicine hasn't been both inevitable and beneficial. No doubt about it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, if you look for the other side of the sword, you can find things even there. Like there were 2 Harvard-led studies that found that if you're checked into a teaching hospital with certain cardiac conditions on the dates of a national cardiology convention, when the most esteemed specialists are away, you're less likely to die.
Oh, gosh.
And the researchers concluded it's because you're less likely to get these procedures that those specialists have learned to do over and over and over and over again, and will keep doing reflexively if it's not the solution to the problem. And so that's not to say those people aren't important, but when we're incentivizing people to become more and more specialized and in such a trench that they're kind of disconnected from the larger strategy of what they're doing, there can be really perverse effects, even in domains where that specialization has been tremendously important.
Mm-hmm. So you tell a lot of really fascinating stories in Range, and Namisha is asking, what are some of your favorite examples in those stories? She's saying specifically generalists, but I know there are fascinating specialist stories in there as well.
So I was about to start with my favorite story of a study. I can tell you my favorite study in there too, but I think my favorite story, that would probably be between 2 stories. One chapter talks about these 17th and 18th century orphans of the Venetian sex industry, all girls, who were sort of taken in by a social services organization and became the greatest musicians in the world, and were like Vivaldi's kind of musical laboratory. That was just fascinating. And I spent a lot of time in a rare books library going through some archival material that I don't think had been published anywhere before, because the researcher who was collecting it unfortunately passed away in the middle of her work. So that was just fascinating. The other, I think, has to do with this woman. This is me and Frances Hesselbein. So I tell Frances' story in the book, and Frances did a lot of volunteering. Her career strategy, as she liked to call it, was do what's needed at the time. So she was very much an opportunistic zigzagger, and she took her first professional job at the age of 54.
Oh, wow.
She had 1 semester of junior college education, and she went on to become the CEO of the Girl Scouts, which she saved. She tripled minority membership. She added 130,000 volunteers. Those are people she paid in a sense of mission. She turned the cookie business into $1/3 billion a year that kept growing from there. And she fundamentally changed the organization from one that was preparing girls for life in the home to one that was preparing them for careers in math and science and all these sorts of things. And she was just this incredible person who zigzagged like crazy wherever she saw a need. And when I first went in and asked her some question to the effect of what had prepared her for leadership, she goes, don't ask. I didn't know that I was being prepared. I was doing what was needed and just going where something was needed. And that caused me to accumulate all this knowledge about leadership. And I use her to open a chapter I write about research about how people find fulfilling work. It's called the Dark Horse Project at Harvard. And one of the reasons it's called the Dark Horse Project is because they usually view themselves as having come out of nowhere, because they do these sort of zigzags and they find work that's particularly fulfilling, even though they weren't sort of targeting it from far out. It's through this series of small pivots where they kind of say, here are my skills and interests. Here are the opportunities in front of me right now. I'll do this one, and maybe a year from now I'll change because I will have learned something about myself, or there'll be a new thing I want to do. And that was very much what Frances did. And she, by the way, she's 103 and a half in this picture. She just passed away at 107 and was still working up into her 107th year. And as she would say, who knows what's next? Because she had gotten so used to pivoting that she would say that. And let me see if I can find. I have a souvenir that I love that she gave me. That I maybe just have in my backpack, but let's see. If not, you can keep asking me the next question, and I will hear. But there's a really cool. She introduced a badge that is binary code. Oh, here it is. So this was when she was changing the organization into one that was preparing girls for like math and science careers. There's a binary code badge. She gave me one of those, which I thought was pretty cool.
That is really cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure. So that was definitely. I mean, she became a little bit of a sort of a personal role model or mentor for me. So that went beyond just the story aspect.
Mm-hmm. So M is asking, can you talk more about why failure and quitting are the incubators of success?
Yeah. So I think there's sort of two parallel streams, but let's to go to something that I wrote about in the afterword for the paperback specifically. Because I think quitting sort of needs a rebranding because quitting makes it sound so bad when a lot of times what people are doing is strategically pivoting or not continuing to go down a course that is not as fruitful as they had hoped. And I write in Range about this problem the Army was having starting in the mid-1990s with losing the people that they were grooming as future leaders, basically, like losing them almost immediately as those people were allowed to leave. Lots of them were leaving. And at first they threw some money at these people and that didn't work. Those were going to stay, took the money. Those were going to leave, left anyway. $500 million taxpayer money, didn't change retention. And then a group of officers who are also scientists started studying this problem, and they found that basically the Army had developed what's called a match quality problem. So match quality is the degree of fit between someone's interests and abilities in the work that they do. It turns out to be important for your sense of fulfillment and your performance. And when most of our economy was these sort of more upper out structure of your work life, the Army being also an upper out structure worked quite well. But then the private sector transformed into one where there's tons of lateral mobility. People can move around a lot more to adjust to their interests and abilities. And organizations exist for a shorter time in general. And the Army had not changed. And so these young people who were learning things about themselves in their late teens and early 20s, but having no agency over changing career track to match that, would just leave. And so in response to that, the Army started these pilot programs, like one called talent-based branching that's going on now, actually, where instead of saying, here's your career track, get up or out, they would take these promising cadets and they pair them with sort of a coach-like mentor, and they have them dabble in at least 5 different career paths in different ways. And they reflect on how those fit them. They have to keep track of those reflections in an online portal. That turns out to be a very important thing, to actually systematically reflect on your experiences. And one of the really fascinating things was that 90% of people who went through that changed one of their career preferences. 90% just from having this little chance to dabble around a little. And that improved people's match quality, right? And there's this whole area of work like that shows that when people make these sort of strategic pivots and they gather more, not only more skills, but more knowledge about themselves, that improves their match quality, which is a tremendously important thing. And as one of the researchers who worked in this area told me, when you get fit, it looks like grit, right? Grit is the now famous psychological construct based on persistence of effort or perseverance and consistency of interests, which is not changing what you're interested in. And I would argue that some of that consistency of interests has been overweighted. And I talked to Angela Duckworth about this, so we can, she's one of my favorite conversation partners. But when you get people in work that has high match quality for them, they will display characteristics of grit, even if they didn't before. So I think we should think of grit as more of a state than a trait being a function of you no matter what you're doing. whereas state being maybe a stable function of you, but that changes with context. So, David's an introvert at a giant party, but an extrovert with a small group at work. Both of those things are true, and stably so. And so I think one of the things that helps people is one of the big advantages of people who are willing to quit or strategically pivot is that they're pivoting based on things that they learned about themselves and their opportunities. And they couldn't, your insight into yourself is limited by your roster of previous experiences. So you shouldn't expect to make a good choice right off the bat. And you still take those skills with you, right? So these pivots should be informed by what you learned at the last stop. And so I think that's why that was one of the hallmarks, this sort of habit of mind of saying, who am I? And how should I pivot based on that, was a habit of mind of people who find fulfilling work.
Mm-hmm. And would that be then an example of what you talk about as sampling periods?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And I think talent-based branching is just a much better way of branding strategic quitting. It just sounds much cooler. So that's good. I think in terms of in quitting in general, and there was this one study I write about in Range that showed that basically by the time people quit a job or project, it's way past the time when they should have, because of something known as the sunk cost fallacy, which is if you've invested time, energy, money, anything in a project, in a relationship, in a career, whatever, you will continue down that path, even if you could look at it objectively and say, like, I never would have wanted to be on this path, right? It's just because you've started, you'll keep doing it. So Maria Konnikova, one of my favorite writers, wrote about how con men know to start with small asks, because once people start giving, they sort of say, like, well, I already started, and they just keep going down that path. And so I think part of our intuition definitely prevents us from quitting too early for the most part. I think the much bigger problem is quitting too late because of the sunk cost fallacy. So we don't move on when we're no longer learning or no longer happy or all those sorts of things. And that work showed that people who agreed to abide by the results of a coin flip and switch jobs if they were thinking about switching ended up more happier than the people who were thinking about switching but abided by the coin flip and stayed where they were.
Mm-hmm. We have a lot of people asking questions about quitting as it pertains to their children. And so David is asking, how do you think that your findings in Range will or have influenced how you parent your own kids, your own kid or kids? Is there anything that you did to specialize in pursuit for your own successful career that you would actually discourage your child from emulating? And I guess, how does sampling play into that with children? Should we start then, or should we wait until they're adults and let them sample?
Yeah, I think it has affected I actually use the talent-based branching thing I described as an analogy for my approach to parenting. I know it doesn't sound great to use like a military analogy for your parenting, but the discipline is not the same. But my first book was about genetics, and one of the things that convinced me was that I didn't write a lot about behavioral genetics in that book, but I read a lot of behavioral genetics and interviewed a lot of behavioral geneticists in that book. And it convinced me that to a larger degree than most parents think, first of all, you can definitely ruin a kid with deprivation. There's no debate about that. But above a certain level of enrichment, it convinced me that parents are not the cause for effects to the extent that they think they are in who their kids become. And at first I thought that was a little bit of a bummer, because I totally would have been a 10,000 hoursy parent. But then I sort of thought, well, maybe that means I just have to sort of provide a good environment, but I don't have to try to micromanage someone. So maybe that's sort of liberating for me. And so I sort of view myself as the coach or mentor figure in that talent-based branching process, where you arrange a variety of opportunities for the kid. That's always going to be limited based on where you live and what you're into and whatever. But then I want to help him get the maximum amount of signal from each of those experiences of what did he learn about himself? What did he like and not like? What met expectations and what didn't? How should that inform the next thing you try? So that's really where I view my role, is pushing a little bit of smart experimentation, underwriting some risk for experimentation, and then talking to the kid in a way that constitutes what's called self-regulatory learning, which is essentially reflection on what did you learn? What do you want to learn next? How can you do that? Are you sure you want to do it? Who do you need to help you do that? um, and just help them become who they're going to become and find things that are fulfilling for them. So I'm definitely not pushing. I get asked all the time since I was a writer at Sports Illustrated, what sport are you trying to get your kid in? As if, now that I lulled all the other parents to sleep with range, now I'm going to make my kid like the Tiger Woods of blockchain or whatever. But no, I want to expose him really widely. I wanted to specialize when I was younger, but it didn't really work out. Like I was very linear goal direct. I wanted to go to the Air Force Academy when I was a teenager. I wanted to do certain sports. I went through football, basketball, baseball in high school, but I ended up running track in college. And so it's just my plans for the things I wanted to specialize in turned out not to be fits for various reasons. So I wasn't intentionally trying to build this broader toolbox of experiences. I think I was doing what the people in that Dark Horse project do, which is getting somewhere, being like, this isn't exactly what I thought. And I've learned about something I'm good at that I didn't know about. So let me take it over to this other area. And so I think it's really having these self-reflective habits. And when I say habits, I mean writing it down. It turns out that people do not reflect enough. And so yesterday I was reading this study about teams doing surgical procedures in hospitals. And some teams would spend 100% of the time that was studied doing the procedures, getting more and more experience. Other teams spent 80% of the time doing the procedures, 20% of the time reflecting on the lessons, why things went well or poorly. And the teams that had the reflection time ended up performing a lot better than the teams that just gathered more experience. So it turns out we just don't do this as much as we should, this kind of reflection on what happened and why in our experiences. And so I think one of my most important roles as a parent, other than just, loving your kid, is causing some of that reflection to happen so that they're learning about themselves and their options much, to as great a degree as they can. And imbuing that habit of self-reflection also.
Yeah, but that's definitely important, like getting into the habit of self-reflection. I think when you're young, you think of having a journal or a diary or something like that, but if there isn't a reason to continue reflecting, you just get out of the habit of doing it.
Yeah. And a good way to do it is to ask. So when I was trying to write my first book and I was talking to a researcher who studies this in the Netherlands, named Mariah Elfrink Gemser, I had never written anything over like a 5,000 word magazine article. And now I have to write a 90,000 word book. The structure is totally different. There's nothing. And so I sort of asked her, could she suggest questions for me? And she gave me these ones that were, what am I trying to do or learn right now? Why? Am I sure I want to do or learn it? Who do I need to help me do or learn it? And then once you do the thing, what met my expectations and what didn't? What was I better or worse at than that was unexpected? What did I like or what was I bored by that was unexpected? And answer the same every month. And at first I thought, well, I'll always answer these the same, but I never answered them the same twice. So I found that to be very, very helpful. To tack onto the parenting point, by the way, I think a lot of parents, the sense I get is that they're worried about missing a prodigy, that their kid might be a prodigy and miss it. No. Probably not going to happen. The prodigies tend to show up only in a few specific areas that are very well constrained and rule bound, like classical music, golf, and chess. And they announce themselves. Tiger's father didn't start having him golfing because he was trying to force him to be a golfer initially. Because Tiger was very physically precocious and showed this interest. Tiger himself said in 2001, I think it was, my father never once asked me to play golf. It's the child's desire to play that matters, not the parents' desire to have the child play. Or Mozart, probably second most famous prodigy ever. I was going through some of his old letters, and you'd find a letter where a musician who was playing with his father came over to their house to play like a quartet, and young Mozart wants to play, and his father's basically says, go away. You haven't had any lessons. You can't play. And Mozart starts crying. So this other musician named Andreas Schachner says, well, I'll play with him a little bit in the other room. Okay, keep it down, Leopold Mozart says. And then they hear the playing coming from the other room and walk in, and I remember Schachner in his letter wrote, little Mozart was emboldened by our applause to insist he could also play the first violin part. And then he does that. And then his father reacts to that saying, whoa, something's going on here. So those kinds of prodigies, again, in these very kind of constrained environments, tend to announce themselves. And so I don't think we have to worry about missing them.
Mhm.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't know if I have up in my hidden slides in the air, Angela Duckworth, the same week that Range wrote out, Angela Duckworth, who wrote Grit, I'll just show them, wrote a newsletter called Summer is for Sampling, where she talked about how, it's boring to like read words on a slide. So I'll just leave it up and say it. She wrote about, they just Google Summers for Sampling and you can see her newsletter, but let me see if I included this part because she mentioned in it, maybe not. So Google it if you want to read it, and her paramecium principle, which is another newsletter she wrote about this smart pivoting. And she writes that she's the guru of grit. She says it took her a decade of her adult life to find the place where she should apply her grit, right?
Yeah.
A decade. So I think if the idea that people take away from some of her work is that they should just pick something and stick, because again, you get awarded for consistency of interests. I'm not sure that's what she thinks. Actually, I'm pretty sure that's not what she thinks.
Mm-hmm. Benjamin is asking, how, in your opinion, do people misunderstand the main themes or takeaways of Range? Or maybe do they miss or over apply the general idea?
Interesting question. To be honest, I think the people that have read it, I'm going to stick to people that have read it. People that have read it have, by and large, gotten it, and not only gotten it, but gotten it in the context I was hoping they would get it, which is to say, I didn't mean to say we should have no specialists. Mm-hmm. I think of this Freeman Dyson. I use his quote. He was one of the eminent physicists of the 20th century and a beautiful writer, said, we need both birds and frogs. The frogs are down in the mud, seeing the granular details of problems. The birds are soaring up above, not seeing those details, but integrating the knowledge of the frogs. And he said, for a healthy ecosystem, we need both. The problem is we're telling everyone to become frogs, and that makes us very inflexible. And that's totally how I think of it. And I included that quote because I was worried people would think I was saying that we don't need specialists. And that's not the case. And I have to say, I've been extremely pleasantly surprised by people who read the book don't seem to have a dogmatic takeaway from it. They seem to realize that it is making the argument that most of us at certain points should sacrifice increasing depth to be able to see the bigger picture and connect knowledge. But that it isn't like a dogmatic thing of we never spend some time going deep. So I've really enjoyed that. I think there's some specific studies that, like, a very famous venture capitalist ragged on me on Twitter a little bit, who said he hadn't read the book during the ragging. But I cited this one study that showed, between MIT, Northwestern, and the Census Bureau, that showed, and this is someone whose writing I enjoy, by the way, was ragging on me, so nothing against him or anything. But this study that showed that the average age of a founder of a fast-growing tech startup, top 0.01% of growth, on the day of founding was 45, which is quite contrary to our sort of Mark Zuckerberg narrative. Zuckerberg, when he was 22, said young people are just smarter. Mm-hmm. Don't catch him saying that today, obviously. And the venture capitalist called that research urban legend, I think it was. And maybe he took that citation to say that young people can't be good founders, but that research pretty clearly showed that a 50-year-old was a lot more likely than a 30-year-old to start a fast-growing startup. So I guess I just would have liked to have that conversation with him, to see why he felt that's urban legend, since it's, he may have methodological disagreements with the research, but it's like, an MIT and Northwestern, the Census Bureau doesn't fall under urban legend, at least for me.
So we're at the top of the hour. So one of the things that the last question I always ask is, do you have any book recommendations that people should run out to their library to check out immediately? But it occurs to me that you probably also just have recommendations in general of studies and things like that you might want to.
Yeah, I'll give a few book recommendations. So Uh, let me recommend. I'll give a since I'll be undermining my own book as a recommended book here. But the no, and so in one of my recent newsletters, I have a newsletter called Range Widely, and I interviewed Annie Duke, who's one of the greatest female poker players ever, and I interviewed her about her new book called Quit, that is about how people can become more strategic about quitting, and how we can fight against that sunk cost fallacy. Because that whole book is about how people hang on too long, and research showing that people don't quit enough, basically. And so I really enjoyed that. So I definitely recommend that book. I'm a huge fiction reader. If you're interested in writing and structure, I think fiction has a lot more diversity of structure, so that's the place to go. So I'll recommend two on the opposite side of the spectrum. Two big ones, okay? Because they're worth reading. War and Peace and Ulysses, worth reading. Oh, let me see if this thing keeps. I can draw like a heart or something. War and Peace is long, but it's an easy read because Tolstoy tells you everything you need to know. And in some parts, in Range, I write about forecasting research and how the most narrow specialists turn out to be the worst forecasters and makers of predictions. Although there's an inverse relationship between fame and accuracy. So the people you're seeing on TV might be scientifically proven to be the world's worst forecasters. And the terms for foxes and hedgehogs that are used for sort of the deep versus the broad thinkers and how they do in forecasting come from a philosophy essay by Isaiah Berlin, which is based on War and Peace. And a lot of War and Peace pushes against this idea that there's sort of a single tool or set of knowledge you can use to engineer war, and then you'll just win it like a chess game. And it's much more flexible and adaptable and things like that. So there's a connected message in that book, and it's a fast read. Ulysses I finished recently, and one of the great things about it, I mean, I almost threw it against the wall in chapter 3, but I'm glad I didn't, because it caused me to do so much outside reading in order to understand it. Like ulyssesguide.com, read the episode guides before you read any chapter. That it just turned into one of those incredibly deep, rich experiences where I was learning new words and learning new history and learning about modernism in general and literature. And that takes forever. And I could have read 10 other books in the meantime, and it wouldn't have been as deep of an experience. And so I kind of recommend those sorts of experiences for everyone reading. If you don't have as much time, pick up the collected fictions of Jorge Luis Borges. And a lot of them are metaphysical thought experiments. And I can't read them before I go to bed, or I won't be able to sleep because my mind will be turning too much.
Well, thank you very, very much for those recommendations. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's truly been an enlightening hour and such a pleasure to speak with you about your book. So thank you so much for being here.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you very much for having me.
With that, I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in to our author talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible, and we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below that live stream video, you can find a link to David's book. We look forward to seeing you all on March 21st when we talk to celebrity chef Gernard Wells about his most recent cookbook, Southern Inspired, and again on March 28th when we chat with New York Times bestselling author Pam Jenoff about her new book, Codename Sapphire. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us. Have a good afternoon.